monopsony evaluation, right, if we're going to evaluate this model, we have to ask ourselves, well, does it pertain? Does it exist? Okay, does it exist? Is there such a thing as monopsony? Now, the greatest purchaser of many things in the world is the state. The state is probably the biggest culprit as a monopsonist because in the UK, for example, in the NHS, it probably buys around about, I don't know, current statistics, but about 90% of all health services that are out there. We could look at the Department of Education, and that also buys approximately 90% of all educational services out there. So it is certainly in a position to push down wages and to act as a monopsonist and to keep people poorer and fewer people working than need to be. On the other hand, in America, it may be the Department of Defense, with an S in America, I do believe. And again, they probably buy, probably almost 100%, but 95, 90% of all military resources. Now, when we look around the world, the state is in a position of monopsonist in many cases. However, what we have to think about to evaluate it is, does this necessarily mean that the state remains a monopsonist and is in a position to push down wage rates as suggested by the straightforward monopsony neoclassical diagram? So in other words, the market rate will be over here, quantity over here, so let's say W star, always label diagrams, and QL, and let's call it Q1. Okay. Now the monopsonist, we remember, wants to put down the wages at this level. So Q, let's do WM, QM. And this is what the state would want to do because it's the single buyer of educational services in the country, the single buyer of defence services, single buyer of the NHS services, etc. And you choose whatever the state does in your country, then certainly wage rates will be pushed below. But we've got to ask ourselves, well, is this necessarily true? It's a very interesting model, in which case, the unions act to increase wages and increase the quantity employed, as we've seen, which is a very exciting move. However, we've got to ask, is it true? Is it the case that this person, in terms of the state now, our little m, has the market wrapped up and basically everybody has to run to M in order to become a teacher or a nurse or a doctor, etc.? Well, no, because when we look at our workers, now they could be a variety of workers, could be nurses, could be teachers, and I think we've just got an issue here. Let's just take him out there. There we go. No, it still looks male, doesn't he? Never mind. Okay, there's stick figures, kids. There's stick figures. Okay. Now, M is thinking, right, I can push down your wages. I'm going to exploit these masses. And this would be a nice little Marxist twist on the neoclassical theory here. I'm going to exploit them. But these people also have other opportunities. There are things called substitutes in the labour market. And always in market economy, what we have to think about is, what is the substitute for somebody? Can they go and find work elsewhere? Well, of course they can. Now, if they want to be a nurse, there are many opportunities, not just in the NHS. People run to the NHS because, I don't know, it's the National Horror Service. Not sure why. Maybe they want to find some more horror stories. Because, let's face it, they care about people. They want to work in the industry, but it doesn't have to be in the NHS. There is the private sector nursing. There is the foreign sector. A lot of British nurses may go and work abroad. There's also the case that they may do something in the complementary services. It's done that thing again, right. Complementary services. So instead of just being a nurse in the NHS or working hard, looking after A&E patients, no, then again, it keeps doing that. Right, let's get rid of that. There, go back to the pen. Thank you. It's very sensitive, this pen. So complementary services. So you don't have to be working in the NHS, in A&E, etc. You could train as a physio. You could do some retraining. You could be a care assistant in a home. Okay, it's a bit of a demotion for a nurse, I guess. And what else have we got? Could work in chiropractic. Obviously retraining is required to do this. Osteopathy, etc. I've met quite a few people who are nurses who are now working in these sectors because the transfer earnings change and they move from one job to another. But it could also do something completely different. If the nurses' wages are too low and they feel that the state, in the guise of M, is exploiting their wages, pushing them low, well, they can wander. And as long as there are substitutes available, as long as there's freedom of movement, then the transfer earnings in other places can become more attractive and off they go. So M is not quite faced with what would have been in the old days a company town. A company town is where these people were stuck geographically, so there's geographical immobility. They had to work for M, and there was no chance of moving elsewhere except without a long journey. Of course, people could take that long journey. So there was always a substitute there, but perhaps the transfer earnings were much higher. The opportunity cost of leaving was higher. But where one critic points out that an interesting area where monopsony can exist is in the professional markets. For example, in baseball, in football, soccer, etc., every now and again you get a movement, and this has existed economically as well, to introduce wage caps because professional footballers and soccer players etc. Are so damn expensive that they want to put a cap on their earnings. And putting a cap on their earnings is in effect acting like a monopsonist and saying we're going to push your wages down. However, when we look at the professional market, even if they ended up working at WM, and WN is the wage below what would be the market clearing rate, if you're still below this equilibrium, it's not as if you're on the breadline with the professional market. It's not the case, therefore, says the critics, that you would be hard up. And unlike what we're normally told with monopsony, you've got a very exploitative capitalist or the state employing people with low skills. That's not the case. People with low skills tend to have more opportunities to get unskilled labor in a variety of different jobs because they're not tied to that job. When somebody gets incredibly professionalized and incredibly expert in their area, then certainly if they're facing a single buyer, they could push down the wage rate. But this wage rate is going to be much higher than what is normally given on the market because, after all, professional baseball players, soccer players, football players, etc., aren't exactly hard up and on the street. Okay, so there's a critique of monopsony. The question is, does it exist? Let's just go with the highlighter. Does it exist is a big question. To the extent that it does, it's often state created, but even then, because of the existence of substitutes, there is the possibility of exit. So nurses may find private foreign complementary medicine to get into or do something completely different if the wages are too low. And ironically, where we do find it is in the professional market, such as the sports world or perhaps doctors and consultants who face a single buyer for their services, which then pushes down the wage rates. But these wage rates are still nothing to be concerned about in that they're much higher than the average wage. Okay, so there's a little bit more on monopsony. I hope this helps. It's an area that some of my students texted me on and said, can you get a bit more detail on this and why the supply curve is kinked? Okay, signing off for today. Have a wonderful day. It's bank holiday in this country, so the sun's shining, and have a great afternoon. Cheers. Bye-bye now.